This video is a breakdown of all the events surrounding the tragic fire on the Christmas morning of 1945. We will cover all of the mainstream story as well as the odd occurrences that call that story into question. And finally, we'll go over the theories around the missing children and what I believe actually happened that night. Our story begins in 1895. Giorgio Sodder was born in Tula, Sardinia, Italy, during the fascist rule of Mussolini. He immigrated to the United States when he was only 13 alongside his older brother. Sometime around this, he also changed his name to George Sodder. George searched for work and eventually became a truck driver driving dirt for construction sites, until he eventually drove coal trucks, where he started his own business, driving for the coal mines. Jenny Cipriani was a storekeeper's daughter who also emigrated from Italy. George and Jenny got married in 1922, just north of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Not long after, they had their first child. And between the years 1923 and 1942, they had 10 total children. The family's second oldest son, Joe, was serving in the military for World War II and was not living at home. Now we'll get into the actual events starting on Christmas Eve of 1945. This may seem like more detail than is necessary, but everything I'm going to cover comes into play later with the theories. So the first thing we know about this Christmas Eve is that Marion, the oldest sister, had worked at a dime store, and she brought home gifts for her three younger sisters, Martha, Jenny, and Betty. Their mother allowed them to stay up past 10 p.m. as long as Maurice and Louise, their brothers, stayed up with them and also did their chores. By this time, George and the two oldest brothers were already asleep as they had been at work all day. We also know that Marion had fallen asleep on the couch, and Jenny, their mom, had also gone to bed around this time. From all accounts, it seems that Martha, Jenny, the child not the mother, Betty, Maurice, and Louise were the last ones awake that night. But at 12:30-ish, Jenny woke up to the phone ringing downstairs. Now, this phone call was very strange. It was a woman that Jenny didn't recognize, who apparently had a weird laugh, and there was laughter and glasses clinking in the background. Jenny told her she had the wrong number and hung up before going back to bed. But she had noticed that some of the chores hadn't been done, the lights were still on, and the curtains weren't drawn, which are two things that the children would normally do if they stayed up later than their parents. So Jenny returned to bed, only to be woken up about a half an hour later to a loud noise hitting the roof, and then whatever hit the roof sounding like it rolled. So she stayed up for a little bit, heard nothing else, and went back to sleep. And within the next half an hour, she woke up again to the smell of smoke. She looked and found out that George's office room was on fire. She woke up George, and George woke up the two oldest sons. Now at this point, we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that in the first telling, John, one of the older sons, went upstairs to tell his younger siblings. He recalled it later. He said that he just yelled upstairs and never actually saw his siblings up there. Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. leave the house with their parents. But when George realizes that 5 of his children are still inside, he desperately tries to get back inside. He breaks a window, cutting his arm in the process, only to find out that the stairway was engulfed in flames. He ran behind his house to try to find a ladder, but the ladder was missing. So he decided he would drive a truck up next to the house so he could climb upstairs. Neither of his trucks that worked the day before were working this morning. Jenny went to a neighbor's house to try to call the fire department, but the phone couldn't get through the operator. A passerby also tried to call the fire department at a tavern, and that call couldn't get through the operator. And now at some point, the neighbor went into town, into Fayetteville, to try to get a hold of the fire department. Now, again, the story's kind of split here. One account said that she found a phone and she was able to call the fire chief. Another account says that she tracked down the fire chief. But despite all their efforts, the fire department didn't arrive until 8 a.m. that morning. It's also worth mentioning that Marion claims to have been watching the upstairs windows throughout the entirety of the fire and never saw the children. So at first, Martha, Jenny, Betty, Maurice, and Luis were believed by the parents to have died in the fire. But the fire department did a brief 2-hour or so search and could not find any remains. Fire Chief F.J. Morris said that the fire could have been hot enough to cremate the bodies. Despite the fire chief suggesting George to leave the property, 4 days after the fire, George couldn't bear seeing the property and buried it in 5 feet of dirt. The coroner and jury decided that the fire was due to faulty wiring, and on December 30th, death certificates were issued to all 5 children. Now, because of the lack of remains, George and Jenny weren't convinced that their children were actually in the house at the time of the fire and that they didn't die. So 4 years later, in 1949, George convinced Oscar Hunter, a pathologist in Washington, D.C., to supervise an excavation of the property. During this excavation, they found several small bone fragments. They sent these to an archaeologist for the Smithsonian Institute named Marshall Newman. Marshall Newman figured out that these were human lumbar vertebrae and all belonged to the same person. Although he concluded that these vertebrae were not of any of the missing children, the development of the vertebrae would indicate someone between 16 and 17 years old, whereas the oldest child, who would have died in the fire, was 14 years old. He did say it is possible that Maurice, the 14-year-old, his bone structure could have matured faster than usual, and so it could belong to him, but it's not likely, especially considering that the bone had no signs of burn or anything like that. Newman decided that the bones probably came from the dirt that George had pushed on top of the property after the fire, which is still a little strange, and there's kind of some theories around where those might have come from, but likely not from the children. He also suggested it was very strange that no other remains were found, as in a wood fire, typically full skeletons would be left behind, which this, contradicts what Morris said earlier about the bones being cremated in the fire. Now we'll get into some of the strange events I didn't cover that led to a lot of the alternate theories that followed. So first, this is a little abstract, but it did lead to some theories, is that George was known to speak out against the fascist government of Italy, and specifically Mussolini, although at this point Mussolini had died. Also, something the family quickly pointed out was that if the fire was electrical, then it didn't make sense that the Christmas lights stayed on throughout the beginning of the fire. Also, we don't know exactly when, but at some point a man visited the house looking for work and remarked that the fuse boxes would, quote, start a fire someday. This confused George because he had just gotten the house rewired, or according to another account, got the house inspected. Another strange thing is that the 2 older sons claimed that they saw a car parked on the main highway that was watching, like the people inside were watching the Sodder children come home from school. Now, there's not really proof or even indication that they said this, but it was mentioned in so many stories I figured I'd have to mention it. I don't know where it originated from though. Another really strange thing that happened was a life insurance salesman, Rosser Long, got rejected by George and said the house would go, quote, up and smoke and your children will be destroyed. And apparently he said this because of, quote, the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini. I don't know how much weight we can give into this, but it kinda sounds like just a scare tactic for insurance, although a pretty crazy one at that. Now, there's a couple other characters in this that may or may not have played a role. First being Fiorenzo Giannutolo, I probably am not saying that right, his cousin Cleante, and this Rosser Long guy were all on the same Rotary Club. Also, Fiorenzo owned a competing trucking company, which might be worth mentioning. He was also a co-signer of a loan to George, and he had a $1,500 insurance policy in a mortgage clause on the Sodder's property. Another interesting thing about this is the 2 cousins, the Giannutolo cousins, and Rosser Long were all on the jury that decided the cause of death, which, is just kind of strange. Who knows? The last thing is that there was supposedly a thief that the neighbor saw stealing from the Sodder family. He, I guess, took a block and tackle and then got arrested afterwards. And when he got arrested, he admitted to cutting the electrical line. I'll go ahead and just read this real quick because it's pretty crazy. During the fire, a man was seen stealing a block and chain from the Sodder's garage. When later charged with crime, he also admitted to cutting the Sodder's electric line. He never went to trial. Miss Sodder said he probably snipped the telephone line by mistake and said, "We never would have gotten out of there alive if the lights had been cut." So, I don't know what to make of that. There's very little about him other than that paper and then one other mention of him I could find. So, yeah, his name was probably Lonnie Johnson as far as I can tell, but again, it's kind of frustrating. There's barely anything about this guy. Now it's time to take a look at all the theories. We'll discuss the main theories I could find, as well as what I think happened at the end. Keep in mind, I don't know what actually happened that night, and most of the rest of this video will be comprised of my opinions, so if you're interested, I'd recommend you look into this, come to your own conclusion, only just take my views as what they are, and not the reality of the situation. First, we'll cover the kidnapping idea. A common theme of many theories is that the children were kidnapped. This is what the parents seem to believe as well. Now, I can see why to some extent. The missing remains as well as the lack of returns from the excavation can make this seem very plausible. I do think it falls apart though as soon as we look into how this would have actually happened. One idea is that it happened during the fire, so the fire was like a cover for the kidnapping, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, considering almost immediately, like half the family was outside and they were watching the house. Marion says she was watching upstairs for the entirety of the fire. Not to mention George was going around the house trying to find ways to get upstairs. So it seems impossible that kidnappers could have gotten 5 children down in that time and off the scene without any of the family noticing. Another possibility is that they were kidnapped before the fire, so the fire was there to explain the missing children. This is what I believed at first. And the reason for that is that it's pretty strange that the 5 children kidnapped were also the last ones awake. So maybe the kidnappers came in and took the kids out of the house, but I don't think that could have been what happened, considering Marion was asleep on the couch and the rest of the family was asleep downstairs. It's a shame we don't have a detailed layout of the house so we can see exactly where everyone would have been sleeping to see how possible this is. But it still doesn't seem likely that 5 children could be kidnapped without there being any noise to wake up anyone downstairs. But this does sound more realistic if we consider that they could have left the house. So we know that one of the chores for Maurice and Louise to do before going to bed was feeding the animals outside. So it's possible that if they left to feed the animals and then got kidnapped and then didn't come back in, that the 3 sisters would go out to look for them. This is the only way I can see the kidnapping story have actually happened, but we don't have any proof for any of this. It's kind of just filling in the holes ourselves. I kind of doubt that this is what actually happened though, as it just seems a little far-fetched. Another obvious theory, which is probably what you're thinking, is that the fire was hot enough to cremate the bodies. Marshall Newman, the archaeologist, did say it was very strange that there were no remains found, but that doesn't mean it couldn't have happened. It's a little difficult to find information on, the temperatures of everything, but I decided to have a nice and pleasant conversation with ChatGPT about the temperature at which bodies cremate. And it said 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for a span of 90 to 120 minutes. One thing we do know is that the fire only went on for about 45 minutes before the house was completely burnt down, although it still would have been hot afterwards. I also asked it how hot a house fire might get over the span of 45 minutes, which, who knows how accurate this is, but it says it could get up to 1800 degrees, but likely would have only stayed there for 10 to 20 minutes at most, so almost certainly not hot enough for an actual cremation. Now, a good rebuttal to this is that the house likely contained coal, considering that's what most fireplaces used at the time. So depending on how much coal was in the house, it's possible that the fire would have gotten much hotter and sustained the heat for long after the fire. So that makes it kind of hard to say. Now, this still calls into question whether or not the fire was intentional or if it was electrical. As far as I can tell, there's 2 good arguments for the electrical theory. First of all is that the fuse box and the telephone line were in George's office where the fire started. Although, according to the telephone repairman, if the telephone line was cut, then it was likely the fuse boxes. Also, this theory eliminates the human malice that would have gone on, and I think that makes it more convincing that we don't have to, like, rely on someone doing something horrible. But this does ignore all the strange occurrences, the phone call, the thing hitting the roof, and all that. So, what do I think happened? I think the fire was intentional, but it wasn't meant to cause any harm, and I do think that the 5 children did die in the fire. Again, I don't know, but what it looks like to me is that the insurance trio I mentioned earlier had a lot of reason for this fire. They would have profited directly, and if they could get the Sodder family to move, then it would likely be more profitable for Gianotolo's trucking business. Like I said, I don't think they meant to actually hurt anyone. I think they just wanted the Sodder family to move and the property to be destroyed, because this explains the weird phone call and the object hitting the roof, like a warning to wake everyone up before the fire actually happened. Now, it still seems strange that none of the children made a noise or went to the window during the fire, but this can actually be explained. In most house fires, especially upstairs, the smoke is going to be a lot heavier. And yeah, in most house fires, more people die to the smoke. And it's entirely reasonable that none of the children would have woken up and that they would have passed out to the smoke before the fire ever actually reached them. Now, don't get me wrong, this theory isn't perfect. To accept this idea, I also have to accept that the kids forgot to do their chores, which I don't think is unreasonable. And also that none of the remains were found, despite they were probably there. It seems unlikely that all of the remains would have been cremated. We just have to assume that they weren't found. Again, this is all just opinion, but I think this covers most of the oddities in the story, or at least more than the other theories in my opinion. I suggest everyone look into this. It goes even deeper than I described here. And yeah, that's all I got. I hope you all learned something, and thank you so much if you watched this far. I really appreciate it. Editor John here. If you guys feel like supporting me, check out my sweatshirt. Link will be in the description. Alright, have a good one.